Defamation is irresponsible speech to harm another person's reputation. If it's written, it's libel. If it's verbal, it's slander. There are 4 facts to prove in order to win a defamation suit. The defamatory statement has to have actually been made. The statement that's made has to be false. The statement has to have been communicated to someone other than the plaintiff. And in slander cases, the plaintiff must show some injury that resulted from the defamation. Sometimes a slanderous statement is so harsh and potentially damaging that the plaintiff is assumed to be damaged and does not have to prove injury. For example, if someone were to accuse you of committing a serious crime or accuse you of having a sexually transmitted disease or accusing you of being an unchaste woman if you're female, or charges you with professional incompetence. Sometimes public personalities like politicians and movie stars have a hard time winning a defamation case because they have to prove that the defendant acted with actual malice. In special cases, defendants are given extra protection against defamation. In courtrooms and legislatures, speakers have absolute privilege, meaning that they can speak freely so long as what they're saying is true. False imprisonment is when someone is held against their will without reasonable cause. An employer, for example, who doesn't let an employee go home when he or she is sick is guilty of false imprisonment. If a police officer detains someone with no reason to suspect him or her of a crime, this is false imprisonment. In general, a store can detain a person if they suspect them of shoplifting if there's a reasonable basis for the charge. It used to be that no recovery was allowed if the injury was only emotional. Today, most courts allow a plaintiff to recover from a defendant who intentionally causes emotional injury, but the injury must be extreme and outrageous. Battery includes touching someone in a way that's unwanted or offensive. The touch doesn't have to hurt the victim. Sexual touching is offensive, but not necessarily painful, but it's still considered battery. An intentional action that does hurt some is also considered battery if it's unintentional. Assault is an action that causes the victim to fear an imminent battery. Assault can occur without the battery ever actually happening. For example, if you pulled a gun on someone, even if it's not loaded, this is considered an assault. Trespass is intentionally going onto someone else's property uninvited or remaining after they've asked you to leave. Keeping an object like a car or truck on someone else's land and refusing to move it is also trespassing. You might also be trespassing if you go onto someone's property mistakenly believing that it's public property. Conversion is taking or using someone's property without their consent. Fraud is injuring someone else by deliberate deception. A jury may award payment for injury to a plaintiff who wins in a civil suit. The single recovery principle states that the court must decide all damages, past, present, and future, at one time and settle the matter for good. Damages may include money to recover loss like medical expenses, to restore lost wages if the injury kept the defendant from working, or to compensate for pain and suffering. The purpose of compensatory damages is to help the victim recover what was lost, but punitive damages are intended to punish the guilty party for conduct that was outrageous and extreme. It's designed to keep the defendant from doing it again. It's also meant to make an example out of the defendant to prevent others from doing the same thing. About half of the states have passed limits on tort awards. In most cases, a jury can award whatever seems reasonable for economic damages. Non-economic damages usually can't exceed a prescribed limit, however. Intentional torts that occur almost exclusively in a business setting are called business torts. Someone can file a claim if they experience interference with a contract or a prospective advantage, or if someone has violated their rights to privacy and publicity. The Lanham Act, passed in 1946, prohibits and punishes businesses who make false statements intended to hurt another business. To win a case under this act, the plaintiff must prove that the defendant made false or misleading fact statements about the plaintiff's business, and that the defendant used the statements in commercial advertising, and that the statements created a likelihood of harm to the plaintiff. Interference with the contract exists if the plaintiff can prove that there was a contract between the plaintiff and a third party, and the defendant knew of the contract. Also, that the defendant induced the third party to breach the contract or make performance impossible, and that there was injury to the plaintiff. The defendant can justify the interference if he can prove that he was protecting an existing economic interest, or that he was protecting a public interest, or that the existing contract could be terminated at will by either party. Interference with prospective advantage exists when there is a relationship which gives the plaintiff a reasonable expectation of economic advantage, even though no contract exists, and when the defendant maliciously interferes and prevents the relationship from developing. The defendant can justify the interference if he can prove one or more of these elements: that he was protecting an existing economic interest, or that he was protecting a public interest, or that he was simply competing for the same business in an allowable business situation. Intrusion, or prying into someone's private life, is a tort if a reasonable person would find it offensive. For example, if your landlord taps your phone, or an ex-girlfriend or boyfriend stalks you or peeps in your windows, this is intrusion. Technology is creating new ways for a person's privacy to be exploited, which has forced the need for new laws, like the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. This act prohibits interception and disclosure of wire and electronic communication. And the Stored Communications Act prohibits the unauthorized access to a facility through which an electronic service is provided. Commercial exploitation is when a person's image or voice is used for commercial purposes without that person's permission. A wide variety of intended acts can have unintended consequences. With intentional torts, the defendant may not have intended to harm the plaintiff, but her deliberate actions have resulted in the alleged injury. Anticipating the harm that can result enables us to consider carefully the actions themselves.